بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله وكفاه والصلاة والسلام على رسوله المصطفى وعلى عباده الذين ارتضى ومن بهداهم اهتدى وبآثار أهل المدينة اقتفى وبعد فالسلام الله على القوم. أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بكم يا جماعة لنقف عند آيات القرآن مواقف. Today we're going to take a look and pause at some mawaqif, some stations for some reflection from Juz 5, wal muhsanat. And muhsanat means those fortified or secured women. And in this context, Ihsan with the Sad is used in the Arabic language within the context of familial relationships to refer to marriage. Okay, so it's a kinaya referring to marriage. And we're continuing through Surah An-Nisa, surah about women, and that's because of the amount of verses and meanings that are so important and relevant to the discourse of women. So the verse continues telling that what a person cannot, who they cannot marry. And it continues that those things that were forbidden for you, wal muhsanat, and married women to marry them, min an-nisa illa ma malakat aymanukum. And here the discourse of slave girls comes up, and this is something that previously I've done very lengthy videos explaining. It's something we can't really go into, do justice so briefly in this mawqif today, but I do refer you to my previous videos, and inshallah maybe in the future I'll repeat some of those about what is collective consciousness and how it alters over the passing of time. So this verse continues to tell you that these things are permissible, and it mentions that whatever is beyond that a person can go and seek. So it finalizes the list of prohibition that a person cannot marry so and so and so. And I mentioned that previously. I'm not sure if we took a look. There's the verse حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمْ أُمَّهَاتُكُمْ. It's a connection continuing that these things are forbidden for you in marriage. Your mothers, your daughters, your sisters, your aunts, etc., your nieces, and it goes on. It mentions that. On a side note, Jalaluddin Asyuti, something a little a point to just share, that he'd made an observation. He'd said, this is Jalaluddin Asyuti, that right throughout the Quran, that ma min umumin illa waqad khussis, that there is no generic statement. So the Quran does not mention anything that is general illa waqad khussis, except that there is some exemption for that verse. So almost everything, he says, that you will find some exemption for it. So let's say Allah is saying pray, aqimus salah, but there's exemptions. Let's say the person who's unconscious, or the person who's ill, that, well, one could say, or a traveler, or a woman on her menstrual cycle, for example, or the child that is not yet pubescent. They're exempt from that ruling. So that there's no ma min umumin illa waqad khussis. And he says that, however, this was one verse I found that there was no takhsis for, the verse doing tahrim of incest. And years ago, I stumbled upon some notes that I had done when I was studying Ifta, the kind of Mufti course. And this was a point in that I'd mentioned that Jalaluddin Asyuti had said this. And I had added, so I don't know whether he meant it, but I had said, but what about verses like Inna Allah ala kulli shayin qadir? And, Inna Allah bi kulli shayin alim, that Allah knows everything, or Allah is all powerful over all things. Those two are umumin lam yukhassas. There's no takhsis done of those umumiyat either. So it was just an istidrak upon the observation of Jalaluddin Asyuti. So khair, I thought it occurred to me. So this carrying on from this topic, and you can see this whole surah is very relevant to people trying to seize the rights, especially in Jahiliyyah time, and unfortunately today as well in some parts of the world, from women's inheritance to maybe stealing their wealth, to even trade or loans, not giving, not repaying what they owe them, or whether it's to do with marriage and points of justice, and people not, maybe they marry a certain woman so as to confiscate or usurp her wealth. So, yeah. And there was a reflection on that, by the way. I'm not, even though it's from the previous jurors. And we spoke briefly on the verse of that وَآتُوا الْيَتَامَ أَمْوَالَكُمْ, that you وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تُقْسِطُوا فِي الْيَتَامَ, that if you fear you would not do justice regarding the orphans, then فَانْكِحُوا مَا طَابَ لَكُم مِّنَ النِّسَاءِ مَثْنَى وَثُلَاثَ وَرُبَاعَ. And we did speak about, well, this may not, whether it's limited or not in polygamy. But there was a reflection that when I was thinking about this verse, that it occurred to me that I'd never really thought of before. And since the topic is still about Nisa, I think it's worth sharing that, you see, from the beauty and the majesty of the Quran is that it has layers and just infinite gems of understanding that you can take from each verse, and you can come back to it and it might give you something new. And this verse, that why does it begin with the orphans and then go on to say and marry women, and whether in many numbers if you want. But see, a thought that I'd not really observed before was that in one connection, that is it by surrounding yourself, and especially for men, that, and it doesn't have to be all the time, but in certain settings at least, to surround yourself in the company of women so as to be very close, so they could, one is, well, person could say, well, when you're out and about, let's say in the world, there's men and women there, but not in that context, but where they could truly, have your ear and speak to you intimately, even, like, so without fear of repercussions, or they have that. So if a person was to surround themselves, would that prevent them from committing oppression? That maybe there is something in the company of women that is more enveloped in virtue, that in the company of men don't get that. So that was an observation, that because Allah begins that verse by saying, do not, usurp the wealth of the orphans. But if you feared that you would not, then surround yourself in the company of women intimately, as in take them as spouses. And it's almost like there's a leap here. We've changed the topic, or we're trying to figure out what is the connection here. And it occurred to me that maybe that there is this call to virtue, a gentleness that men may not find in the company of men. I thought that's worth sharing. Khair. Back to the verse on muhsanat. فَمَا اسْتَمْتَعْتُمْ بِهِ مِنْهُنَّ فَآتُوهُنَّ أُجُورَهُنَّ فَرِيضًا. This verse also highlights one of the, amongst many controversial topics, the topic of mut'ah, temporary marriage in Islam. Now you'll find in many of the tafsir books a discussion of it underneath this verse, that فَمَا اسْتَمْتَعْتُمْ بِهِ مِنْهُنَّ فَآتُوهُنَّ أُجُورَهُنَّ فَرِيضًا. So what you delight in with them, as in here speaking in the context of marriage, then pay them. So, and Ibn Ashur has a reasonably lengthy discussion on this as well. he does highlight that really it is a weak point, an ilmi point, to connect the topic of mut'ah to this verse, that this verse was not revealed for mut'ah, although some companions did transmit that this verse was to do with mut'atun nikah, and others said no, this is actually linked to mahar, giving the dowry when a person marries. And the dowry is considered by most of the fuqaha, the a'imma, to be a rukn min arkan in nikah. So you have popularly the kind of 4 arkan in nikah. Now, Imam Abu Hanifa, it's transmitted that he challenged it being a rukn, but he said it was an obligation of nikah, and that does make sense as well. And I think it may be a bit of semantics, because there is the nikah known as nikah tafweed. If a person got married and didn't mention the mahar, does the nikah hal yanaqid am la? And the general understanding is that it does yanaqidu sahihan, and it's called nikah tafweed, and the mahar is whatever would customarily be said. And that brings in, once again, a discussion on urf wal ada. So urf wal ada are powerful tools within the toolbox of Sharia. So, going off on a slight tangent, you see, in Islam, we don't generally have a constitution, so to speak. How, let's say, it's popularized by the Americans, the constitution they have. In Islam, we have something called usul, which is legal theory, or to understand it, you could imagine it is a toolbox. And from this toolbox, we make whatever we have to, we go to work based on it, as in constructing the rulings within the Sharia. So what tools go into this toolbox? Everybody would agree that the tools by which, for lack of a better word here, or the usul, the asl, the foundations by which we build, they would all agree it is the Quran is one, and the Sunnah is another. So everybody agrees on this. Most people agree on analogy is one. Some debate with the Zahiri madhab. Ijma' is one that is put in their consensus, although nobody ever agreed on what the definition of consensus is, and they never agreed on consensus, but they say it is one of the tools in the toolbox. Then they disagree on everything between themselves. The Malikiyah, the school of Medina, it has the most tools according to any madhab, to make Sharia, to make law, Islamic rulings and fatwa. And so it has whether some have counted out 13 and some have counted them as more, but the point is it has many tools in there. The Shafi'iyah have the least. They really just stop with those 4. Then you've got, I suppose, the Hanafi madhab, and the Hanbalis are probably similar to the Malikiyah, a bit short. So one of the tools is al-urf wal-ada, custom and convention, that we use this to stipulate law, to generate law. So whenever we're giving Islamic law, whenever we're giving rulings, we base them on what the custom and convention of the time says. So this nikah tafweed, for example, a person doesn't mention the mahar. Well, what would the people of that convention normally stipulate? And that becomes stipulated. So these things decide, so if you got into a dispute with someone, let's say you ask somebody to buy something for you, and now you have a dispute, you take it to the courts, it would be based on things like that. So you could say, well, let's say a popular one like meat. Is fish meat? Well, even in the Western culture, I think it is meat, but they consider it, they still put it separately. In some cultures, they would lump it together. So, if somebody had asked you to, contracted you to provide them with meat and you just provided them with fish, and then they took you to court, well, the custom would decide. So here in Nikah Tafweed, once again, it's the custom. This discussion on mut'ah, circling back to that, it is really one of those issues that it became so controversial just because of its nature. You take something it's something that's to do with the nature of sex. It's going to be very controversial anyway, especially from the perspective of religion. And then you add something like, well, a temporary marriage. And you can imagine the kind of social shame that that's going to bring. And then this ended up becoming a dispute between Sunni and Shia, which in all fairness, it never was a debate between Sunni and Shia Islam. It was just a debate within Islam. So everybody agreed that mut'ah used to be allowed in Islam. And then they disagreed after that. So they all agree that it used to be allowed. Then there's some debate that the general Sunni understanding, I say general because it was not all Sunnis, but it was most Sunnis overwhelmingly. But they believed that it became prohibited, that the Prophet ﷺ abrogated it. And then they disagree, when did he abrogate it? So did he abrogate it in Khaybar? But then we know that it was practiced after Khaybar, during the time of the Fath of Mecca. So then the general Sunni opinion is it was abrogated, then it was made permissible, then it was abrogated again. So it was abrogated twice, cancelled twice. Some companions continued to believe it was always permissible, like Ibn Abbas radiallahu an, Imran ibn Hussein radiallahu an, and there's some narrations from Sayyidina Ali. Now, the popular narrations from Sayyidina Ali is that afterwards he said no, it was not permitted. And in fact, many of the hadith we have in the Sunni tradition come through Sayyidina Ali to say that it was prohibited. So you have, and then this became, with the Shia, they said it was never cancelled, ever. And then some Sunni took an understanding that, well, maybe it wasn't constant abrogation, but it was that it was allowed with darura, that when there was a necessity, it was allowed. And then this is what was transmitted by some of the tabi'een like Sa'id ibn Jubair, and later became the position of Ibn Taymiyyah's grandfather, Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah, and also what Ibn Ashur argues for in his tafsir of the Qur'an. But this topic, the nature of it, it's one that so easily evokes disgust in people. So it became a very difficult topic to even discuss, and then the fact that it became between Sunni and Shia, it got incredibly, incredibly heated and almost blacklisted to even discuss. So, and I guess that's unfortunately the nature of a lot of themes and topics within the realm of faith. And this is where we are reminded in Islam that always to take a path away from being riled up by emotions so easily. But yeah, this, for people that want to, the general understanding within Islam is that it is haram. But those were the kind of discussions around it. And this verse, it continues into the second verse that says about those people who could not marry, and it continues about speaking about slave girls in the past, which, by the way, Islam would have ruled out today. The topic of slavery would categorically be haram. And it would use one of the tools which I've mentioned, known as Masalih Mursala, which is a tool within the school of Medina that rulings are based, there is an arc, what in English you would call trajectory hermeneutics, that when the time reaches that, it would become haram. So just as those who say, for example, there's many things that, and I know that becomes another debate in itself, that in the time of Sayyidina Umar they became haram, they say. And amongst them, people put the 3 talaqs. They put this discussion of mut'ah in there as well. In fact, there's a hadith in the Sahih, actually, of Imran ibn Hussein, where he says that this used to be permissible, but then in the time of Umar, he made it haram. Now, so, and I understand the general understanding, the ta'wil to that would be, well, Sayyidina Umar declared it haram based on his understanding of the Quran was Sunnah. But coming back here about circling back to slavery, that when the time would be right, the Sharia would mandate it's haram. And that's what we call masalih mursala. It has long been practiced within the Sharia. It is a mandate of the Sharia according to the school of Medina. Hence, slavery is categorically haram. And any person that would feel that it's differently today, I mean today, that's not to say previously it was not haram, but it would have been abrogated. And you say, well, how can something be abrogated after the time of the Prophet ﷺ? Well, it can, based on the asl, the tool within the toolbox of masalih mursala. Now, that does leave a challenge for those people who don't believe that tool exists in the toolbox. And so they then have to find other ways to come around to explain why they would feel slavery is haram, or maybe they shy away from categorically saying so, because like the Shafi'iyya would find it, because in their toolbox they don't have that the asl of masalih mursala. Right, speaking of which, this verse here speaks about speaking about the slave girls. It mentions فَإِذَا أُحْسِنَّ, and if they have attained a status of ihsan, of fortification, which means in this context marriage. فَإِنْ أَتَيْنَ بِفَاحِشَةٍ فَعَلَيْهِنَّ النِّصْفُ مَا عَلَى الْمُحْصَنَاتِ مِنَ الْعَذَابِ. And if they commit adultery, then the slave girls their punishment would be half of what min al-muhsanati, of what normal women, non-slave women would have as a penalty. This verse opens up a huge discussion, as Ibn Ashur and many would highlight, on, well, that can only be speaking about lashing, which is in the Quran, fajlidu, that to lash. It could not be speaking of a stoning, because there is no half of stoning. So this makes a very intriguing discussion once again. And and these were the things that that Sheikh Abu Zuhra, for example, when he highlights amongst other people, that the verses they used to highlight the whole, which is once again became a controversial topic, the topic of stoning, whether it did exist or whether it was something. They all agreed that it existed in the sense that it was a continuation of the Judaic law, of the Torah and the Talmud, that it was continuing. But when the verse came in Islam about lashing, that it abrogated that. And did that still carry on? According to some people, let's say many people felt that no, it still carried on, so that was their interpretation. But did it stop with this verse? With the verse of the lashing? And this is then used by those who say it was abrogated as a proof in saying, فَإِذَا أُحْسِنَّ, when the slave girl is married and commits adultery, she only gets half of what married women get as a punishment. Others then did interpret this saying, here, ihsan, because this became another discussion. Does a slave girl, is there even a punishment of adultery or fornication for a slave girl? And that, it's fascinating to read that was quite a heated discussion in the past, in the early part of this ummah, to many narrations at one point, and Ibn Ashur brings a narration, two narrations from Sayyidina Umar, one being that the slave girl had no punishment at all if she was never married, because he felt that, well, she wasn't as bound by the social ethics that normal people were bound by. So that makes a really intriguing discussion that Ibn Ashur brings. But he does highlight that there is another riwayah that he was then shown this, that, okay, the married women do. And some people interpreted this ihsan to say, well, here, to fortify doesn't mean marriage, it means to become a Muslim. And this is then transmitted from the A'immatul Arba'ah, that they said that the four Imams then took an interpretation, or their madhabs more likely took an interpretation of saying ahsinna here means they became Muslim, to which Ibn Ashur brings the discussion of Qadi Ismail, a legend. And I have to say, after a while, I've read Qadi Ismail's name and his interpretation, where he said that is all, he said that is so ba'id, to say ihsan here means Islam. He's clearly talking about marriage. But there's something, wallahi, when I was reading the tafsir and I was going over, because he's always been this figure, this kind of don that I've always admired so much, Qadi Ismail ibn Ishaq. He was a legend of the school of Medina. Absolute legend. One of the teachers of Imam Bukhari, by the way. He was a legend in almost every field. Hadith, you name it, in Arabic grammar, in fiqh. He's the one that revived the entire school of Medina, brought it to life in Iraq. And there's just something, this... I remembered that poem that Asami lam tazidhu ma'rifatan innama ladhatan dhakarna. Allah, that... it's not that these things increase those people, but it's just there is a ladha, a delight to it that we find. Allah, may Allah bless. Seriously, these people were they were just heroes, man. They were just dons of their own world. But yeah, he had mentioned that, and there is more to discuss here. One, just keeping it, because one is the verse 34, that الرجال قوامون على النساء, that men are the kind of protectors and providers of women, and this is set as a paradigm. The question is this here prescriptive or is it descriptive? Is it على الوصف المعتاد, على الحكم المعتاد, or is this in the sense that we are saying it is بوحي من Allah, it is a command? Obviously Allah is not saying it as a command, it's a statement. الرجال قوامون على النساء, that men are the providers and protectors of women, بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض, and by what they spend from their wealth and so on. Now, does this mean that this is an injunction, Allah saying this is how it must be, or is this the Sharia explaining that this is how it generally is? It can be read in both ways. Ibn Ashur and other people would they'll highlight these differences, and generally the understanding of this verse is this is the general norm. This is descriptive of how the world generally works. It doesn't mean that in some societies, if they were matriarchal, or if women in certain households, they are providing, is that permissible? I mean, it's permissible. So it doesn't mean that this is that a woman cannot provide, that these roles could not be reversed. In some settings, in some contexts, in some homes, in some societies, maybe they are. But the general norm is that الرجال قوامون على النساء. Okay. But if there was a household where the woman was providing and doing all of that, it doesn't mean it's haram or anything. She can choose to. You get stay-at-home husbands nowadays, so things like that. You could get, but there is. Speaking of the fitrah of men and women, and I know this would be very controversial in this day and age now, maybe even as a thought experiment. I think if the thought, I was once having a discussion, and I mentioned this. I said that if, let's say there's a woman who's not, just taking this as a hypothetical, let's say she's not working, not doing anything, she's just whatever, just stays at home, and the husband, let's say he provides for her, so a man is giving her, spending money and taking care of her and doing stuff, and let's say she helps out in the house and the home and things like this. Let's even take the hypothesis that there's no children involved, and let's take the hypothesis that there's multiple women, because of just in this thought experiment. So a man, let's say there's 4 women or 2 women, 3 women, and he's just giving expenses, but he's working, he's doing his thing, and they they might help out in the home and help out with other things, and they might just do hobbies, like they might whatever, let's say they're artists or they're into things, but they're not necessarily earning. Or even if they are, let's take them to be, let's ad absurdum, take the argument to its nth degree. Let's say that they're absolute, like complete, like they use the term, like just doing nothing, just like an absolute bum sitting at home doing nothing. Now, let's say you take that on one side and you flip the scenario. Let's say there's a woman where men are like that, 2 men, 3 men, even 1 man, an absolute, like somebody that's just wasting, or we take it to the absurdum argument, they're doing nothing, just away, is like an absolute bum just sitting at home. And there is something about the tabi'ah and the fitrah of men, not always, but often Allah has placed it in those, where it is found, that it still wouldn't bother these men as much as it would bother a woman if the man was like that. And I think that speaks to our fitrah. Fitrat Allah allati fatara an-nasa alayha. That men do have this thing that it's still seen, like it would still be to like it could be negligible, like it wouldn't bother them. But the sight of a man that is useless irritates everybody. Like, I think a man just sitting around doing nothing, there is something that stirs a strong emotion against it. And that's not to say, I'm not saying in any way that women should not be high achievers. They should be as well. But I was just speaking to the fitrah that is evoked at the sight of that there is something. And we see maybe that spirit in this verse, that الرجال قوامون على النساء, that Allah speaks in that. So not to mean that women can't be qawamat, but that there is something in the fitrah of men, that there is samah, that even if they were just taking care of even multiple women, it wouldn't. True men are rijal, the ones that are true, I don't just mean useless, because here's alif lam is referring to al-ahd, the right kind. Yeah, so I thought that's worth sharing. And then Allah goes on to speak about, people, الَّذِينَ يَبْخَلُونَ, those people who are stingy, وَيَأْمُرُونَ النَّاسِ بِالْبُخْلِ وَيَكْتُمُونَ مَا آتَاهُمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ, that Allah then describes such people as kafir, even though don't have to be kuffar. You get people from the believers that might be stingy and miserly. وَأَعْتَدْنَا لِلْكَافِرِينَ عَذَابًا مُهِينًا. Why? Because it is almost like a kufr. It is a kufr of the ni'mat Allah. And the verse before that worship Allah and do not commit shirk, وَبِالْوَالِ, this sums up the entire Islam. Entire Sharia is summed up in this verse 36. that worship Allah, no to shirk, absolute no. Avoid superstitions, shirk, like the plague. وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا, take care of your parents. Allah. وَبِذِي الْقُرْبَى, and the kinship. وَالْيَتَامَى, kindness to orphans. وَالْمَسَاكِينَ, help those who are poor. وَالْجَارِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى, but there's also a kinship of the neighbor, of the people around you. They're also like, see, friends can become the new family. وَالْجَارِ الْجُنُوبِ, people who are afar from you. Take care of them as well. وَالصَّاحِبِ بِالْجَنْبِ وَابْنَ السَّبِيلِ, Allah. وَمَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ مَنْ كَانَ مُخْتَالًا فَخُورًا. And then those who are tight-fisted, Allah describes them as kuffar almost, وَأَعْتَدْنَا لِلْكَافِرِينَ عَذَابًا, because they are kufranun ni'mah. So what a powerful verse, wallahi. And there is the in the verse of Ar-Rijalu Qawwamuna, and we'll wrap it up with this, in that verse 34, it is also one of, a point of one of the most, especially in recent times, controversial verses or rulings that are relevant to that, is about what if there is dispute, or you fear nushuz with a woman, with the spouse, where you are taking care of her, providing, doing all of this, and there is this source of disrespectful disobedience, and however that may be, the term nushuz covers it, that you fa'idhuhunna, that you admonish, like you speak wise words, wahjuruhunna, abandon, fil madaji, especially you separate your the bedroom for places of where you sleep, and then wadribuhunna, and then to hit them. Now this verse has brought about so much discussion, and even Ibn Ashur has a huge, a whole discussion on it as well. فَإِنَ طَعْنَكُمْ فَلَا تَبْغُوا عَلَيْهِنَّ السَّبِيلَ إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ عَلِيًّا كَبِيرًا. And then it goes on to say, well, if there's further dispute, you should mediate and try and seek conciliatory efforts. This, so people had discussed, what does wadribuhunna mean here? And I do have certain videos about this in the past, and I think it's been a good few years since I've made them. I do refer you to them, that in Surah An-Nisa, verse 34, the hitting verse. So I do have an old video, you can watch that. I'll do, I won't really be able to do justice in this short time to this whole discussion. But what I would say is that, just like Ibn Ashur, this verse is literal. Some people had said wadribuhunna here didn't mean hitting, it meant kind of, leave them alone, walk away. But generally speaking, the verse does, one reading it would understand it to mean that. So what does that mean? Does it mean today you could just go and hit somebody? What Ibn Ashur speaks about is, we come back to that discussion of the toolbox of al-urf wal-ada, custom and convention. And that sets parameters on law. So there were certain customs and certain cultures in which people felt that there was an element of physical discipline. In those cultures, that did apply. In cultures where it was deemed an utter no-no, just like, let's say today, in this day and age where we live in the West, it's deemed utterly wrong, that this would then be prohibited and haram. So it would be referring to those times especially. And you have to remember, in the Prophet's time, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the culture was this kind of warrior culture. It was almost the closest example you'd get in the Western understanding is like that of Vikings, for example, because all they lived on was raiding. They just raided other tribes, and that's how they looted and raiding and warriors and fighting to the death, and that's how they were. In that culture, the women were a part of that as well, and they felt too that there was this order of discipline. Now, to us, this may sound bizarre, and we're entitled to that opinion, and I would say that it is haram for people to hit in this here where we are, and this is not, because this is not, our culture is not like that, and it should not be like that because of trajectory hermeneutics as well. The what I spoke of earlier. Now, the masalih mursala, the tools we have, and how, and that interprets that how we read the Sharia for our age. But there, in certain cultures, you know, and when I made that video, the hitting verse, a few years ago, in it I discussed that there was a that there was a viral clip at the time. I think it was from a woman in Morocco, or was it Tunis? I can't remember now, but it was North African woman, very modern, contemporary, young, and she was also a bit of a like a celebrity. I think she was a singer or something. So maybe not absolute top of the, A-list kind of singers, but she was some kind of a reasonable, like an influencer, and quite popular. And she, in an interview, was asked something, and she made a statement. And she's very modern, not apparently, and the reason I'm saying that is so as to, this wasn't indoctrinated by, let's say, the certain religious kind. She wasn't apparently, wearing hijab, or very modern, very kind of all online, strong, of the age. And she was asked a question, and she said something like, if I did something wrong and my man didn't slap me, then what kind of a man is he? Now, this caused huge controversy at the time, right throughout the Arab world. And people said, shame on her, she's encouraging domestic abuse. And then she gave several interviews after that saying, look, I'm totally condemning domestic violence, but I'm just speaking about a principle that she said she felt was still part of the Arab culture, and the kind of thing that men, this concept of discipline. Now, it sparked huge outrage, but it was a point of reflection that there are certain cultures that see things like that, an authority and a discipline. That's what the verse was speaking to primarily when it came in a culture where everybody, or most people, the backdrop was one of warriors, one of, fighting constantly to the death, raiding, looting. It was like that non-stop warring, and the women were a part of that. And they felt not that necessarily, it doesn't mean that this wasn't a kind of masochistic thing about them wanting to be hit. It was something about saying that there was something about that discipline that they saw. And the Quran spoke to that community primarily, and by extension, the rest of the world, leaving with us the tools of al-urf wal-ada and masalih mursala for when we're in our day and age. It fits. And it's like Islam is the water, the riverbed, the stream, that it takes the color of the ground and the bed over which the rivers and the streams flow. May Allah bless us all. Shukran once again. And this in Ramadan, these are special days. Make dua, observe, say a kind word for me if you can as well, for my mother as well. Salamullahi alaikum wa khuda hafiz.